Part A, Part B questions can be particularly challenging for students because they require you to think in two different ways. One, you have to figure out what the answer to the question is, which can be challenging enough in and of itself. But then you have to find a piece of evidence that matches that answer. And very often, what I have found is that students tend to get overwhelmed and look at both of the questions and really just kind of make their best guess at it. And they really just kind of don't work them strategically. Part A, Part B questions are kind of like a deadbolt door. So I don't know if any of you have these types of doors in your houses, but they're the types of doors where if you have a door that has a lock up above the handle and then it has a lock on the handle, you need to unlock the door first in the handle, and then you need to unlock the lock above the handle. If you only unlock one, you're not going to be able to get into the door. So Part A, Part B questions, I call them deadbolt questions, because essentially you have to get Part A right. If you don't get Part A right, you're not getting any points whatsoever. So my advice to students on Part A, Part B questions is really to not even look at Part B to begin with, to really spend your time and use your multiple choice question strategies on Part A, and to really figure out what your answer is for Part A. Most of the time, Part A, Part B questions are going to ask you about main idea. They're going to ask you about author's purpose. They're going to ask you about character traits. They're going to ask you about character motivation. They're going to ask you about theme. So they should be asking you things that are really big and central to the entire piece. Because in Part B, what they're going to do is they're going to pull lines from all throughout the text. So it has to be a pretty big question. So I'm going to model and think aloud the types of thinking that I do with Part A, Part B questions as a guide for you. And then we're going to try some Part A, Part B questions together, and then you're going to go off and try some on your own. So really the best way to get good with these questions is to practice with them, and most importantly is to use strategies and not let them overwhelm you. Because if you work smart through these questions, you can figure them out, and if you get Part A right, you're much, much more likely to get Part B. Because we know Part A, Part B questions are combined points. So if you get Part A wrong, you get no points, even if you happen to guess Part B correctly, which is very unlikely. So I've read this article. This actually came from an SBAC test that was given 2 years ago to 7th grade. And I have read these Part A, Part B questions, and I've read the text. I'm not going to read it to you now, but I'm just going to go through the type of thinking that I might do. So the question is, which statement best summarizes the central idea of the text? So I know by looking at that word best that there are at least two right answers to this question. And I know that this is looking for an idea that is going to run throughout all of my text. So when I looked at the text, I know that it talks a lot about survival, and I know that it talked a lot about how many of the things we need to survive are already in our environment. So I'm predicting what I think this answer might be before I even go. The writer talked a lot about shelter and clothing, but the writer talked the most about food. About half the text was really about food and how to find food, talked about all about where to find food, and then went through and went into detail about what types of food are edible in natural environment. So that allowed me to eliminate A, because I know that while clothing is in there, it's not in the entire text, so it can't be the central idea. And I know that it is also not C, because while shelter was part of this text, it wasn't something that ran throughout the entire text. And to be central idea, it should be everywhere. So I've now eliminated my choices to B and D. So there are many plants in the wild that are edible. Could that be the main idea? Yeah, they definitely talked about that. And it is possible to find food and shelter in the natural world. So I think that it can be kind of either of those two things. So I'm going to go between those two. And what I'm going to do at this point, I'm leaning more towards B, but I'm going to go on and I'm going to look at my answers now for Part B. Because if I am stuck, I should look for what supports the idea. So part B, which sentence from the text best supports your answer to part A? So I want to take each of these lines one by one, and I want to figure out what are they talking about, and do they support the two choices, B and D, that I have. With clothing, you pretty much have to be prepared to buy your own. So I know that's not going to be my answer, right? Because clothing wasn't it. It was talking about food. B, but the others, food and shelter, are easy enough to find in the natural world around you with a little help. That sounds very similar to this last statement here. So I found a supporting detail that supports one of the choices. Let me keep going on. The boys learn that finding shelter. So yeah, there we go, right? Shelter, it's not talking about food, so that can't be my right choice. You have to be really lucky to come across these in the wild. They're ripe for only a few weeks. So yeah, talking about ripe food, things like that, that was part of it. But B was the only one that really talked about food and shelter, which I thought was the answer to both. So notice I went through and I found the answer that I thought it was, which was D, because I think D incorporates more of what's in the text. So while it talked about plants being edible, it talked about food and shelter. So that's the idea. You want to choose something that's more general when you're dealing with best or central idea. And then when I went down here, the only statement I found that supported it was B. So these questions are going to take you some time, and they're going to take you process of elimination. You're going to have to go through and really narrow down your choices and really come up with what do you think the answer can be. And you may be stuck between two options. But then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go on to question B, or excuse me, part B, and you're going to want to look for lines that support the answer that you chose for part A. Because if there is no evidence to support your answer for part A, then it cannot be the right answer for part A. But if you find evidence to support it, you may have the right answer. So that helps you to be more successful. You're going to have to take time on these part B questions. You might even have to read each answer choice and then paraphrase it or put it in your own words so you figure out what it's asking you. What I like to do is I like to look at the topics or the subjects that are in the sentence. So for example, A was about clothing here. I knew it wasn't about clothing. C was about shelter. I knew it wasn't just about shelter. D was about wild plants. I knew the text wasn't just about wild plants. I knew the text was about food and shelter, which is how I helped to choose part B. You have to go through this process of thinking that helps you to arrive to your answer. So let's try some of these part A, part B questions together.